It's funny how people think they can size you up in the first 5 seconds until they realize they've just made the worst mistake of their lives. On Oakwood Lane, a narrow street that pretended to be peaceful, Robert Langley was pacing his porch like a self-appointed sheriff. He'd lived there for 30 years, and in his mind, that made him the gatekeeper of the neighborhood. Today, his prey was a Nakamura black woman who had just moved into the cream-painted house across the street. He didn't know her name. He didn't care. She had arrived 2 days ago, driving a sleek black SUV and unloading boxes with quiet efficiency. No husband, no kids that he could see, just her. Robert had spent the past 48 hours keeping an eye on her, which really meant standing behind his curtain with binoculars like he was auditioning for a bad detective movie. This afternoon, though, he decided watching wasn't enough. She's up to something, he muttered to himself, clutching his phone. We don't need her kind here. His voice carried a sour confidence, the kind of tone people used when they thought prejudice was common sense. He dialed 911. Yeah, I want to report suspicious activity. There's a black woman in our neighborhood. No, I don't know her name. She's been coming in and out of her house, carrying boxes at weird hours. I think she might be hiding something. Maybe drugs. Or weapons. The dispatcher, to her credit, sounded unimpressed. But Robert made sure to keep his voice urgent, sprinkling in words like threat and suspicious vehicle, until she agreed to send a patrol. Across the street, the woman Dr. Cassandra Hayes was on her porch sipping tea, oblivious to the storm brewing. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried the sharpness of someone who had seen far too much of the world to be easily rattled. She'd moved here to escape the constant grind of Washington, D.C., to have a little quiet. Quiet, it seemed, was a luxury Oakwood Lane wasn't going to give her. The squad car rolled up just as the last sliver of sun dipped below the rooftops. 2 officers stepped out, one young and visibly nervous, the other older and carrying himself with the weary posture of a man who had answered too many calls like this. Robert practically jogged to meet them, jabbing a finger toward Cassandra's house. That's her. That's the one I told you about. She's been lurking around, bringing in who knows what. This is a safe neighborhood, officers. We can't let trouble start here. The younger cop glanced at Cassandra, who was now standing, her cup of tea still in hand. Ma'am, he began. We need to ask you a few questions. Robert cut him off, voice rising. Don't ask her questions, just cuff her. Search the place before she hides whatever she's got. The older officer shot him a look. Sir, we'll handle this. But Robert kept talking, his face flushed. Cassandra's eyes never left the older cop's. She spoke slowly, evenly. Do you have a warrant, officer? The young one stammered. No ma'am, but… Then you won't be searching anything, she said, her voice low but unshakable. Robert barked out a laugh. Listen to her, acting like she knows the law. You're not fooling anyone, lady. People like you don't belong in this neighborhood. That's when the air shifted. The older cop straightened, his expression tightening as recognition flashed in his eyes. He had seen that face before on news briefings, in internal memos. And suddenly, it hit him like a punch. Ma'am, Dr. Hayes? His tone was almost formal now. Robert blinked. Doctor who? Cassandra set her cup down on the porch railing and stepped forward. Director Cassandra Hayes, she said evenly. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The younger officer froze. The older one swallowed hard, glancing at Robert like he'd just watched a man step onto thin ice. You're the FBI director? Robert's voice cracked, the bravado leaking out of him. Yes, Cassandra said, her eyes locking onto his. And I also happen to be your neighbor. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, but no one moved. Cassandra continued, her voice still calm, but now carrying an edge of steel. I suggest you choose your words more carefully in the future, Mr. Langley. Because next time you try to use the police to intimidate someone based on the color of their skin, it won't be a conversation, it will be an investigation. The young officer looked like he wanted to disappear. The older one cleared his throat. We'll be on our way, ma'am. Robert's face had gone from red to pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't find anything to say. Cassandra simply turned, picked up her tea, and walked back into her house without another word. But the story was far from over. Because Cassandra Hayes had learned something in her years at the Bureau, when you want to change a system, you don't just punish one man, you make the whole neighborhood see the truth. and Robert Langley was about to learn what accountability really looked like. Robert barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing there calm, unshaken, delivering that single sentence like a hammer to his pride. Federal Bureau of Investigation. In his world, authority had always looked one way. A white man in uniform, a white man in a suit, a white man with the final word. Seeing a black woman carry it with more composure than he'd ever mustered had done something to him, something he didn't have the vocabulary to name. Fear, shame, anger. Across the street, Cassandra sat in her home office, the glow of her laptop casting soft light across the room. She wasn't reading FBI briefings tonight. She was reading the local neighborhood forum. She scrolled through posts about lost cats, yard sales, and suspicious activity, reports half of which were vague descriptions of young black men walking down the street. It was a pattern she'd seen her entire career, prejudice hiding in polite words. I just want to keep the neighborhood safe. We don't know who they are. Better safe than sorry. Always said with a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. The difference now was that she lived here, and she had no intention of letting Oakwood Lane continue its quiet little rituals of exclusion without challenge. The next morning, she made her first move. By 8 a.m., Cassandra was on her porch with a tray of fresh-baked muffins. One by one, she knocked on her neighbors' doors. "Morning," she'd say warmly, offering the tray. "I'm Cassandra Hayes. I moved in last week. Thought I'd introduce myself." Some accepted with polite smiles. Some hesitated, eyes flicking past her to the street before taking one. And a few, like the Carsons at number 12, opened the door just a crack, murmured something about being busy, and shut it again. She wasn't surprised. Change never started with comfort. When she reached Robert's house, she knocked firmly and waited. He opened the door, wearing a faded t-shirt and a scowl. "What do you want?" "Good morning, Mr. Langley," she said, holding up the tray. "Muffin?" "I'm not taking your muffin." His voice was sharp, but she caught the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "Suit yourself," she said with a small smile, placing the tray on his porch railing. "It's blueberry. Fresh. Have a good day." She turned to leave, but paused. "Oh, and Robert, about yesterday? You might want to read up on what constitutes suspicious activity. It could save you some trouble." She walked away without waiting for a response. Robert stood there, jaw tight, staring at the muffins like they were ticking. By the end of the week, the story had leaked. Not from Cassandra, she wasn't one to boast, but from someone who'd overheard the police officers at a diner. Soon, whispers ran down Oakwood Lane. The new lady is the FBI director. For some, it brought curiosity. For others, quiet resentment. And for a handful, it was an opportunity. On Saturday, the neighborhood association president, Linda Morris, stopped by. She was in her late 50s, her blonde hair pulled into a neat bun, her voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone used to running meetings. "Director Hayes," she began, as if tasting the title. "We'd love to have you at our community safety meeting next week. Your expertise would be invaluable." Cassandra smiled politely. "I'd be happy to come, but I'd also like to talk about safety from another angle, making sure our community is safe for everyone." Linda's smile faltered just a hair. "Of course, we value diversity here." Cassandra knew that phrase well. It was the conversational equivalent of a handshake without grip. The meeting was held in the church basement. Folding chairs in neat rows, a long table for refreshments, and a whiteboard with "Community Safety" written in block letters. About 20 people showed up, Robert among them, sitting near the back with arms crossed. Linda opened the meeting with the usual talk about street lighting and parking violations. Then she introduced Cassandra. "Everyone, please welcome our newest neighbor, Dr. Cassandra Hayes, director of the FBI." A ripple of polite applause. Cassandra stood, scanning the room. "Thank you," she began. "When I accepted this invitation, I thought about what safety means. For most people, it means locks on the doors, good lighting, low crime. But in my work, I've seen that safety is also about trust and fairness." She let the words settle. "In the last week, I've read our neighborhood forum. I've seen posts about suspicious people, and I've noticed a pattern. Many of those suspicious people were described by their race first, and their actions second. Or not at all." Murmurs swept the room. Robert shifted in his seat. "I'm here to tell you," she continued, "that when we define danger by skin color, we create danger ourselves. Calls to police that are rooted in bias waste resources and damage lives. I've seen people lose jobs, families, and freedom because of false assumptions. Sometimes they lose much more. Her voice stayed calm, but it carried weight. This neighborhood can be better than that. You can be better than that. Silence. Then, from the front row, an elderly man spoke. So what should we do? Cassandra nodded. Start with awareness. Ask yourself, would I see this as suspicious if the person looked like me? Talk to your kids about fairness. And if you see something that truly concerns you, describe the behavior, not the person's ethnicity. It's simple, but it works. Linda quickly clapped, starting a wave of polite applause. But Cassandra saw the mixed expressions, some thoughtful, some defensive, some openly hostile. She didn't expect transformation overnight, but seeds had been planted. Robert, however, wasn't ready to let go. That night, he posted a long rant on the forum about outsiders telling us how to live and political correctness run amok. He didn't name Cassandra, but everyone knew. The next morning, Cassandra found a note on her car windshield. Go back where you came from. She read it once, folded it neatly, and slid it into her coat pocket. It wasn't the first time she'd seen those words. It wouldn't be the last. But this time, she had a plan. She called the local police chief, a man she knew from past collaborations, and invited him for coffee. Chief Alvarez was a stocky, sharp-eyed man in his 50s. They sat in Cassandra's kitchen, the smell of dark roast filling the air. I won't pretend we don't get calls like the one your neighbor made, Alvarez admitted. We do. More than you'd think. Sometimes we push back. Sometimes we have to respond just to check the box. And how many of those calls, Cassandra asked, actually turn out to be real threats? Almost none. Cassandra leaned forward. Then maybe it's time for a different approach. Community education. Clearer protocols. Training on bias for your officers and maybe for the neighborhood too. Alvarez raised an eyebrow. You'd lead it. I would. And I'd make sure the message was clear. Racial bias isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. He considered it, then nodded slowly. You've got yourself a deal. The announcement went out the following week. Community Safety and Fairness Workshop led by FBI Director Cassandra Hayes. The turnout surprised everyone. Some came out of curiosity, some out of support, and a few like Robert out of sheer stubbornness. Cassandra spoke about real cases where bias had caused harm, about the law, and about what suspicious really meant. She showed them how to report incidents without feeding prejudice, how to check their own assumptions. At the end, she opened the floor for questions. Robert raised his hand. So you're saying we should just ignore our instincts? No, Cassandra said evenly. I'm saying you should understand them. Sometimes your instincts are about safety. Sometimes they're about fear. And sometimes they're about things you've been taught, things that aren't true. The skill is knowing the difference. For a moment, Robert didn't answer. Then he muttered, maybe, and sat down. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest he'd ever come to one. The weeks after the workshop felt different on Oakwood Lane subtly, but unmistakably. Some neighbors started waving at Cassandra when they saw her. The posts on the forum grew less careless with descriptions. And the police chief had begun quietly logging racially biased calls, sending follow-ups to callers with reminders about proper reporting. But not everyone was changing. Robert, though quieter in public, still muttered to his golf buddies about outsiders and lectures. Cassandra had lived long enough to know that silence didn't always mean growth. It often just meant people were waiting for the next chance to dig in. That chance came faster than anyone expected. It was a Friday evening when the call went out. On the corner of Oakwood Lane and Sycamore Drive, a young black teenager, maybe 15, was walking home from the bus stop, wearing a hoodie and carrying a grocery bag. It was a chilly night, and he had his head down, earbuds in. Robert was driving home from the hardware store when he saw him. That kid doesn't live here, Robert thought instantly. The hoodie, the bag, the way he didn't look, it all fit the script Robert had rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. By the time he reached his driveway, his phone was already in his hand. Yeah, there's a suspicious person in the neighborhood, he told the dispatcher. Young male, black, looks like he's casing houses. You better send someone quick. Cassandra was at her kitchen table reading reports when she saw the flashing lights outside. She stood, her stomach sinking. She didn't need to guess what had happened, she could see it playing out in her mind. By the time she got outside, 2 officers had stopped the teenager. One was asking questions, the other had his hand resting on his holster. Hey, Cassandra called, walking toward them. What's going on? The younger officer, the same one from her first encounter with Robert, looked relieved. Director Jesus, we got a call about suspicious activity. Just checking things out. Cassandra turned to the boy. What's your name? Marcus, he said softly. I live on Sycamore. Just came from the store. He lifted the badge. It held milk, cereal, and a loaf of bread. Marcus, you know your rights? She asked gently. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. She faced the officers. Unless you have reasonable suspicion of a crime, you're done here. Let him go. The older officer hesitated. Ma'am, we let him go. Her voice left no room for debate. The officers stepped back. Marcus gave a quiet, thank you, and walked quickly towards Sycamore Drive. Cassandra stayed outside until the squad car left. Then she looked across the street. Robert was standing on his porch, arms crossed, watching. No shame, no regret, just a stubborn certainty that he'd done the right thing. That night, Cassandra didn't just file a complaint with the police department. She opened an investigation FBI level. She requested the 911 recording, the dispatch notes, the body cam footage. And she sent a message to Robert that couldn't be mistaken for neighborly chit-chat. We need to talk. When Robert showed up the next morning, he didn't look nervous. He looked defensive. I suppose you think I'm the villain again, he said, stepping into her living room. I don't have to think it, Cassandra replied. You're making the same call you made about Meta's time about a child. You put him in danger, Robert. You could have gotten him killed. Robert scoffed. You don't know that. What if he was up to something? What if he wasn't? She shot back. What if he was just a kid walking home, and now he has to carry the memory of being stopped, questioned, treated like a criminal for nothing? That doesn't just fade. That stays with him. Robert shifted, the words hitting something under his armor. But he still clung to the edge. I was protecting the neighborhood. No, Cassandra said quietly. You were protecting an idea of the neighborhood that only exists in your head. And it's killing people, Robert, if not physically, then in every other way that matters. For the first time, Robert didn't have a ready retort. 2 days later, Cassandra invited Marcus and his mother, Denise, to speak at the next neighborhood meeting. When Marcus stood at the front of the room, hands in his hoodie pocket, the place was silent. I was just going home, he said simply. I've lived here for 6 years. But last week, I started wondering if people still see me as part of this neighborhood, or if I'm just a suspect waiting to happen. His voice cracked on the last word. Denise put a hand on his shoulder. This, she said to the room, is why we're here. This is why bias is dangerous. You can't always see what it does, but I promise you it leaves marks. Some neighbors looked away. Others looked at Robert. And for the first time since Cassandra met him, Robert wasn't glaring or scowling, was just staring at the floor. That night, Robert didn't sleep again. Not because of pride this time, but because of the picture in his head. Marcus, standing in front of 20 adults, asking if he belonged. At 6 a.m., he was on Cassandra's porch. She opened the door, raising an eyebrow. Early for a social call. I need to apologize, he said, the words heavy like they'd been dragged out of him. To you. To that boy. I've been wrong. Cassandra studied him. She'd heard many apologies in her career, some genuine, some transactional. This one was awkward, clumsy, but it had the raw sound of something real. I'm not the person I thought I was, Robert admitted. I don't want to be that guy anymore. Then don't, Cassandra said simply. It's a choice you make every day. The change didn't happen overnight, but it started. Robert began showing up to meetings, not to complain, but to listen. He stopped making jokes that weren't jokes. And when he saw Marcus again, he didn't just nod, stopped, said hello, and asked about school. It wasn't redemption in the grand, cinematic sense. It was quieter than that, humbler. But in communities like Oakwood Lane, those small shifts mattered. For Cassandra, it was proof that even the most stubborn minds could be moved not by force, but by truth, persistence, and the refusal to stay silent. Because she'd learned long ago, you don't just win the fight against prejudice in courtrooms or headlines. You win it one neighbor, one conversation, one human moment at a time. 3 months later, Oakwood Lane faced its first real crisis. It started with smoke. At first, people thought it was someone burning leaves. But within minutes, the acrid scent thickened in the air, and a black column rose behind the row of houses on the east end. Cassandra stepped out of her front door and saw the orange flicker through the trees. A house was on fire. Sirens wailed in the distance, but the flames were spreading fast. She grabbed her phone and ran toward the chaos. It was the Miller residential older couple in their 70s. They were still inside. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, shouting, frozen between fear and indecision. Robert was already there, face pale. "They're trapped," he yelled. "Back doors blocked." Without hesitation, Cassandra sprinted toward the front porch. Robert followed. The heat was intense, searing the air. Smoke poured from the windows. Cassandra yanked her jacket over her mouth and pounded on the door. "Mr. Miller. Mrs. Miller. Can you hear me?" A faint voice answered. They were upstairs. Robert kicked at the door until it splintered. Together, they charged inside, the world turning into a choking blur. They found the Millers in a bedroom, coughing, disoriented. Cassandra pulled Mrs. Miller close. Robert guided Mr. Miller. They stumbled back outside just as the first fire truck screeched to a stop. Paramedics rushed in. Neighbors gasped, some crying, some hugging whoever was closest. When the adrenaline ebbed, Cassandra noticed something. The crowd had been mixed: black, white, Latino, Asian, and no one had hesitated to run toward danger. No one had asked who belonged where. No one had measured worth by appearance. That realization hit Robert too. Standing there, soot on his face, he looked at Cassandra and said, "Guess we're all the same when the fire's at our door." Cassandra gave a small, tired smile. "The trick," she said, "is remembering that when the fire's gone." The fire brought the neighborhood closer in unexpected ways. People organized meal trains for the Millers, raised money to help them rebuild, and even formed a volunteer safety group not to police residents, but to protect and support them in emergencies. Cassandra quietly influenced its rules: no targeting people based on race, no suspicious activity, calls without clear behavior-based concerns, and mandatory bias awareness workshops. The group voted unanimously in favor. Robert became one of the group's most active members. He walked the neighborhood in the evenings, not peering through curtains anymore, but stopping to chat with kids playing basketball, helping elderly residents carry groceries, and checking in on Marcus. It wasn't about penance now. It was about pride in being part of a community that actually lived its values. One Sunday afternoon, as summer began to fade, Cassandra hosted a block barbecue in her backyard. Tables sagged under the weight of grilled chicken, potato salad, cornbread, and homemade pies. Music drifted through the warm air. Kids darted between the adults, laughing. Marcus was helping Robert at the grill, the two of them bickering good-naturedly about the right way to flip burgers. Denise sat nearby with Cassandra, both women watching with quiet satisfaction. Linda Morris, the neighborhood association president, approached Cassandra with a plate in hand. "You've changed this place," she said simply. Cassandra shook her head. "No, we changed it. All of us." Linda smiled. "Maybe, but we wouldn't have started without you." As dusk settled, Cassandra stood and tapped a spoon against her glass. Conversations quieted. "I just want to say thank you," she began. "When I moved here, I didn't expect to be part of anything like this. But what we've built, it matters. It's not perfect. We're not perfect, but we're trying. And that's how change happens." She glanced at Robert. He gave a small nod. "It starts," she continued, "when we see each other as neighbors first. Not as strangers, not as threats, just people. And once you see that, you can't unsee it." Applause broke out. Someone shouted, "Speech," but Cassandra just laughed. "Eat your food before it gets cold." Later, as the last guests left and the glow from the string lights flickered over the yard, Cassandra stood alone for a moment. She thought about the first day she'd met Robert, his anger, his certainty, his ignorance. She thought about Marcus, standing in front of the neighborhood, asking if he belonged. She thought about the fire, the smoke, the heat, and the way everyone had moved without hesitation. The fight against prejudice wasn't over, not in Oakwood Lane, not anywhere. But here, in this small pocket of the world, they'd carved out something worth protecting. And as she turned off the lights and stepped inside, Cassandra knew one thing for certain. Change was possible. Sometimes, it just started with a knock on the door. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.